Hey everybody, welcome back to Fab Daddy TV. If this is your first time, welcome. Glad you joined us. I'm your host, Fab Daddy. I'm sitting here in the cab of my project vehicle. His name is Buford. It's a 1983 Chevy Silverado Crew Cab Dually. It had a 454 in it, which was blown up when I bought it. That's why it was a project. Anyway, if you want to find out more about Buford, go ahead and, if you wouldn't mind, go check out some of my other videos. Kind of runs through what he is, where he came from, what he's got, what he doesn't, and hopefully his future. Anyway, if you want to go check that out, we'll wait a second. Are you back? All right. Anyway, now that you're up to speed, I wanted to go through some stuff. While I was working on the truck, I noticed that I was using a combination of metric and standard or / imperial size wrenches. And it's not the first time that's happened. I've run a lot of demolition derby cars from the 80s where a lot of stuff was either metric or standard. Remember on one car, I think it was an 83 Oldsmobile station wagon. It had the 307 engine in it. The engine, of course, those engines, were great for blowing up. But anyway, I think it had an intake leak and some other stuff. But anyway, I noticed when I was taking it apart, again, I used a lot of standard and metric. And I remember specifically what piqued my interest about it was there down on the I won't say firewall because it's called a firewall, but it's more of a bulkhead. But anyway, the bulkhead connector, it's what connects the wiring from the cab into the engine compartment. It has a bolt and a nut that goes through it, and then the bolt coming from the inside was, I believe, standard, and the nut on the outside was metric. The same connector had two different sizes of wrenches that you used for it. And it just got I was thinking about that the other day while I was taking some stuff off of Buford here. So I decided, I wonder when GM decided to start the conversion from imperial / standard to metric, which any modern car nowadays, domestic, foreign, wherever you are, is basically metric. It's kind of almost a universal system now that everybody uses. And to me, it makes sense. I know a couple of guys I work with hate the metric system. I was like, it's so easy. But anyway, so I did a little research, which, as you can see, I actually looked stuff up and printed some stuff off. And I found an article from the New York Times, and guess this, December 7th, 1975. This was printed almost a year before I was born. But anyways, it says General Motors began transitioning to the metric system in 1973. The company notified its 47,000 suppliers of the change by letter, and 6 months later had a meeting with 600 of its nut and bolt suppliers to explain the new thread system. The Chevette, if you've ever driven or worked on a Chevette, the Chevette, which is mostly metric, was the result of this transition. The Chevette, I think the Vega was an early venture into the metric system as well. This says the Metric Conversion Act of 1975 was signed into law by President Gerald R. Ford, officially authorizing the United States to convert to the metric system, which I was in school in the 80s and 90s, and we briefly talked about the metric system, but it wasn't a big deal. The act established a U.S. metric board to coordinate the voluntary transition to the metric system. However, most industries did not participate in the voluntary transition, and the voluntary approach was eventually scrapped. Michael J. Curto, a U.S. Steel Group vice president, again, this is back in 75, was quoted as saying, "We are converting because our customers are." So he had customers at his steel group that was going metric, and he had to keep up. He had to change over to the metric system to keep up with his customer demand. Whether or not Congress acts, other pressures would make, again, this is back in 75, would probably make metrication, that's a word, metrication inevitable in most industries before 85. So here, again, mid-80s, we're talking about where they're not being forced into it, but at the same time, they're starting to keep up with their suppliers. Let's see. The metric again, we go back to the Metric Conversion Act of 75 was signed into law by President Ford. And then the U.S. made a metric push in 76 under Jimmy Carter, who recently passed away at the age of 100. Again, I'm recording this January 2nd, 2025, and he just passed a few days ago, if not day before yesterday. I'm not sure. But the Reagan administration basically backed off around 1982. They realized that they were kind of fighting a losing battle and thought that, hey, let's just let it happen to have a natural course and go that way. The impact of metric in stores, again, this is printed in 75. Noticeably, J.C. Penney's, which I don't think is around, Sears, Roebuck, Roebuck's, that was before Sears and Roebuck became one company, and Montgomery Ward. How many of you out there remember going to Montgomery Ward stores? I vaguely, barely remember them. I remember going to Sears all the time, J.C. Penney all the time. The impact of metric in stores is best seen in hardware stocks, where as much as 25% of the wrenches and drill bits sold are now metric. Again, in 75, there was only 25% of the tools you could buy were metric. You get to when I started buying tools in the 90s, and it was probably about 50-50. My toolbox is probably about split 50-50 metric and standard, because I've worked on so many different things. I worked for Mercedes for almost 10 years. They're all metric. They even have some weird Torx bits that they used. But yet I've also worked for John Deere. So some of that stuff was still imperial / standard. A lot of the newer stuff, obviously, it was metric. But anyway, in cars, you'd say about mid-90s, metric dominated. 80s, you'd find some mix of metric and standard, often on the same car. Again, we go back to that Buick I was working on, and also Buford here. You never know. I mean, I use the same under the hood, use metric and standard. Import cars, metric goes way back. In 1969, Land Cruiser was a metric. And it could be tied to vehicle platform. You'd have some cars, if they'd had a long run of a car, had been running for a long time, they were going to change it over. If they went from one model year to the next, they weren't going to do a change. They'd wait till they got a new line of car, till that line ended, and they started either the next body style or even just a totally different car. But sometimes those long-lived platforms would lead to an annoying mix of metric and standard. Again, going back to the same thing we talked about. Same with engines. A 350 engine. You can still buy, a standard small block Chevy 350, and you can rebuild it out in the parking lot of your AutoZone with a 9/16, a half inch, and a flat blade screwdriver. The aero designs of the late 80s and 90s, like the Ford Tempo and the Ford Taurus, the Chevy Lumina and the Beretta, the Chrysler K cars, man, were those piles. And the minivans, some of those, all the big three were using rebadged imports in the 80s. A lot of those cars came over from Europe. They were already metric. They just put different names and badges on them. Like you look at the Mercury Capri, which is basically, if I remember correctly, was basically a Ford Mustang. Those would all be metric because they were designed to build overseas. Now, there were some, back in that time when they were changing over, you could actually find, and I think you might be able to still reorder or special order them, they were actually metric threaded bolts with a standard head on, or vice versa. If they had like a long running thing where it was converted over to metric, it was still standard, but they wanted to convert it over to metric, they put a metric sized head on a standard threaded bolt. You want to talk about confusing, that's when you're like, what the heck am I working on here? And then some, like if you get around back in the 70s, you'd have, a mixture of different things. This says here, a guy who worked at a Triumph Motorcycles said around 70 that all the bikes were a mixture of fastener sizes. On just one bike, you might see USA Fractional, Britworth British Standard, which is yet another style and size of connector, and metric wrenches. So you never know. So as you get back into these older cars, obviously stuff from the 80s or stuff from the 70s, they're going to be standard. You get the mid 80s, the late 80s, you're looking at a mix. You get into the 90s, you're mostly going to be standard. Or, I'm sorry, mostly going to be metric. So it helps to have more tools. Like I said, you go to my toolbox, you can find just about everything. I've got standard, I've got metric, I've got those strange Torx bits, which were like kind of a star-shaped, six-pointed head, that they use in Germany, which it's actually a great fastener, a great head, because there is a lot of contact between the socket and the head. There's a lot of flat surface there, so you can actually get a lot more torque on them. In my opinion, they're a great connector. They're just kind of an oddball size. So anyway, so just keep that in mind as you get out to your projects. Depending on what you're working on, you may have to go find you some new tools. And hey, there's never anything wrong with going to buy new stuff. So anyway, like to see y'all get out in your shop, build something cool. We'll see you guys later.